Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Carly Shortino Poulter, and I'm the director of the ARC Advocacy Network here at the ARC of Indiana. I'm also a fellow mom. I have a 23-year-old son with autism and anxiety who had an IEP, and I am the mother of a 17-year-old with anxiety who has a 504 plan. And so, I've been going through this for years, and I remember the hours that I would spend um, trying to prepare for my son's case conference committee, trying to go through everything, making sure I knew what all was going on, and trying to make sure that my son could get the education that he needed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about preparing for your case conference committee and knowing what your educational rights are. Now, I'm going to be honest. We have video and audio uh, suspended during this presentation. So if you've got questions, I definitely want you to ask them because I know everybody has a lot of questions. So I want you to put those in the question and answer section. And as we go along, we'll answer those questions. And I know that we'll have a bunch of questions at the end that we'll also need to ask. And so I want to be able to answer whatever questions you have. So for now, let's go ahead and start talking about preparing for your case conference committee. So if you're not familiar with the ARC, we're an advocacy organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. We were established back in 1956, and in reality, a lot of our local chapters actually began as schools. Because back in 1956, if you had a child with a disability, first of all, you were told to place them in an institution. You were told, don't go visit because that would be confusing and cruel. And then you were told to have another baby as soon as possible so that you wouldn't feel sad. And our parents said, forget that. I'm raising my own kid. And they're going to play baseball and they're going to do chores and they're going to go to Sunday school just like their brothers and sisters. But back in 1956, one of those things that was missing was that idea of going to school. Because back in 1956, if you had a child with a disability, not only were they not guaranteed an education, but oftentimes they were flat out denied an education. So many of our local ARC chapters around the state actually began as schools so that children with disabilities would be able to learn. Today, we're the leading advocacy organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities of all ages and their families. We're committed to progressive legislation and public policy to protect the rights and improve the services for people with disabilities. We're home to the ARC Master Trust and the founders of the Erskine Green Training Institute, a post-secondary education option for individuals with disabilities. And we're affiliated with the ARC of the United States. So when it comes to education for students with disabilities, they are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. That is a really, really key term, free and appropriate public education. Sometimes you may hear it just called FAPE, but every student with a disability is entitled to that free and appropriate public education. But let's dig down a little bit into what that actually means. So when they say free, what they really mean is no additional cost beyond what all students pay. So for example, if all students in the school pay a textbook rental fee, or at this point in time, a Chromebook rental fee or something along those lines, then a student with an IEP would also have to pay that. But if a student with an IEP needs to have speech therapy or occupational therapy, or they need an aid part of the day, you cannot be charged additional costs for those services. So that's what they mean by free. The next part of that is appropriate, and they do mean appropriate, not best. Schools are not required to do what's best for a student. They are required to do what is appropriate for a student. So what that means, though, is that students with disabilities should be held to the grade level standard and expectations. There are some times where students with disabilities really aren't held to that grade level expectation and really aren't taught to grade level standards, but that is what is appropriate, is trying to ensure that they are meeting grade level expectations. And it also means inclusion with same aged peers. Sometimes one of the things we see, especially in elementary school, is you may have a student who's in fifth grade and they're taking PE with third graders. Well, that's not really appropriate. They need to be included with their same aged peers. Appropriate also means providing whatever accommodations, supports, and services the student needs to learn. I know that sounds a whole lot easier than it happens, but that is what is supposed to happen. That is what is appropriate, is providing whatever accommodations, supports, and services that a student needs to learn, and cost cannot be a factor in that. I know from experience, sometimes that comes up, but schools are not allowed to use cost as the reason to deny certain accommodations, supports, or services for a student if that's what they really need. And then finally, a free and appropriate public education means educating a student in the least restrictive environment. Oftentimes, that means being involved with their general education, their same grade peers, as much as possible. So let's talk about eligibility for special education because even when it comes to that idea of eligibility, that's where we start having some confusion and some misunderstanding because a medical diagnosis does not automatically mean that a student will be eligible for special education services. Just because your doctor recommends it doesn't mean that they will qualify. Having your doctor write a prescription for special education does not get them special education services. Those are two very different things. Schools have different eligibility standards, and schools do not ever diagnose a disability. Schools determine a qualifying condition for special education services. It sounds like I'm splitting hairs there a little bit. Well, I am to an extent, um, but schools cannot make a diagnosis, and the medical community cannot order special education services because schools look at the impact of the disability on a student's education. If a disability doesn't impact a student's education, they're not going to qualify for special education services. And a Section 504 plan may provide the accommodations that a student needs to access their education more appropriately. So let's get into that a minute. So, so let's start by talking about the evaluations. You may have a medical diagnosis for your child, and you bring that to the school and say, "Hey, we need special education services. We need to get an IEP." Well, a school may insist on doing their own evaluation, and the biggest reason for that is that the medical community conducts a neuropsychological evaluation, whereas school districts conduct a psychoeducational evaluation. Now, the reality is we tend to call both of those psych evals for short, but they actually tend to be very different tests, even though both sets of tests take several hours, and sometimes they may even do that over the course of multiple days to make sure that they're getting a true picture of what the child is able to do, so that they're not testing them on a particularly good day or a particularly bad day, but getting a good overall picture. The tests tend to be different because they have different focuses. Those psychoeducational evaluations are specifically looking at, how a perceived disability or how a perceived impairment impacts a student's education or academic learning ability. Now, there are a few tests that both the medical community and the education community have in common. That tends to be the Wechsler IQ test, or sometimes called the WISC. That's just an IQ test, and that is one that both communities tend to use. The other test that both communities tend to use is an assessment called the ADOS. That's actually an autism evaluation tool. And so sometimes if you have a neuropsychological evaluation that you had done by a doctor, and your child was medically diagnosed with autism because they did the ADOS, there's a chance your school system may go ahead and accept that. Or your school system may say, "That's great, we want to do our own evaluation." That's okay. The other is also true because sometimes we have individuals who only got the educational determination from the school system and they want to get a Medicaid waiver. Well, to get a Medicaid waiver, you have to have a medical diagnosis. And sometimes, especially let's say you have a child who has an intellectual disability, which is an IQ of around 70 or below, Because that is often the same test that the schools and the medical community do in common, there's a chance that your doctor may go ahead and accept that evaluation from the school to medically diagnose that intellectual disability. It's certainly worth having a conversation, but I wanted to explain that evaluation process because because I get calls from families who are like, I don't understand. My child was diagnosed with autism by Riley, and the school's refusing to take the evaluation and saying they want to do their own. It's because the evaluations actually look at different things. And so that psychoeducational evaluation is giving them some additional information that is focused on academics and focused on education that the school may need to be able to provide appropriate supports for the student. So, how do you get an evaluation? Well, ideally, all you have to do is ask. You can ask the teacher, the assistant principal, the special education director. Ironically enough, schools actually have a legal obligation to help seek you out. If they suspect a student may need an IEP or may have a disability, it is the school's obligation to go out and find those students. That's an idea called child find, and that's actually a legal obligation for schools to find students who may need special education services. But the best practice is to make that request in writing. Because if you say, I asked you to do this back in September, can you prove it? So that's why I say best practice is to do it in writing. And I tend to recommend doing it by email because that email provides a time date stamp of when you actually made that request. Then once you make the request, schools have to send you a form to get your official permission to do it. So just making the request is not considered official permission. They've got to send you the form to sign off on that. And then once they have that formal permission signed, schools have 50 instructional days to conduct that evaluation. That's a whole lot longer than people realize because it only counts school days. So that's almost a third of the school year. Now, I will tell you that the beginning and the end of the school year are the busiest times for conducting evaluations. So it might be something where, you may be able to get it sooner than those 50 instructional days, but they do have 50 instructional days to actually conduct that evaluation. Now, one of the things that will occasionally come up is a school refusing to conduct an evaluation. Technically, they can refuse to conduct an evaluation, but they have to have a compelling reason why. We don't think it's necessary is not a compelling, or more importantly, not a legal justification for refusing to do an evaluation. A compelling reason would be we did one 6 months ago and they didn't qualify. And unless something has changed in that time, that can be a legitimate reason to deny that request. But here's the other thing, and I want you to know this. If a school refuses to do the evaluation, you have the right to appeal that decision. Just because they say no does not mean that any of this is over. You have the right to appeal that denial. And then once you do have that evaluation, the school should have a meeting with you to go over the results. Now, sometimes they may do that as part of the case conference committee when they're creating an IEP. But if you want to, you can request to have a separate meeting specifically with the school psychologist to actually go over and make sure that you really understand those results in depth. Now, if the school determines that a student is ineligible for special ed, they say, hey, we don't think he needs this IEP. The evaluation says he doesn't need that. Well, you have a few options. First of all, a 504 plan may be an option. A 504 plan, first of all, that refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And really, that's about accommodations and access, okay? But a 504 plan can be appropriate when a disability does not affect education. So, for example, if you have a child with ADHD, and really what they need is extra time on tests, they need extra time to do things. That's an accommodation, and a 504 plan provides accommodations. So that could be something that can actually satisfy the needs. But a 504 plan does not provide services, supports, or modifications. Okay, so if what you need is speech therapy, a 504 plan cannot provide that. But if what you're really needing are things like, visual timers or reminders, or like I said, extra time, then a 504 plan can be an option. One of the other things that a 504 plan can be used for is if you have a student who may have migraines, for example. The migraines don't really affect their education, but what they do is they come up and the student really needs to go home and sit in a quiet room for a few hours to recover from the migraine. But if there's not an educational impact to that, a 504 plan can allow for things like more absences than a typical student or something like that. Now, a 504 plan does not offer the same level of protection as an IEP, but for some, it does offer what they need. So I'm seeing a question here. My school just told me they aren't legally required to do reevaluations unless they're looking at changes of placement or adding a disability. Asked for that in writing since they insisted it was the law. Got an email that they will be doing a reevaluation a couple days later. Okay, so my dear friend, let me tell you, you jumped about 10 slides ahead of me because that is exactly one of the things we are going to address here soon. But to get back to that 504 plan, sometimes a 504 plan can actually be an appropriate option. It doesn't always have to be an IEP. Sometimes, for example, you may have a student who may have diabetes or may have hypoglycemia. And one of the things that they need is they need to be able to go down to the nurse, or they may need to have a snack when snacks aren't allowed in class. That's something that a 504 plan can address. But here's the thing, just because the school says that you are not eligible for special education services does not mean you have to accept that. You can absolutely contest those results. And one of the ways you do that is by requesting an independent educational evaluation. Now, I want to also point out that if your school district has a special or is part of a special education co-op, that special education co-op is not considered an independent evaluator for an independent educational evaluation. Now, the school can refuse to do that, but again, they have to justify why. Saying we don't think it's necessary, or, we don't have the money to pay for that, or simply no, is not a reasonable justification. Justification would have to be something like, we just did an independent evaluation 6 months ago and nothing's changed. So there has to be a legitimate reason why they are denying an independent educational evaluation. When you request that independent educational evaluation, schools are supposed to provide you with a list of outside agencies that they have contracts with to conduct that evaluation. And you, as the parent, get to choose which one of those agencies is going to conduct that evaluation. Now, I've seen some school districts where they only have a couple of options listed. I know my school district, because we've had to do this a few times, literally had 4 pages of options for us to choose from. So that varies by school, but you as the parent get to choose which agency from the ones they have contracts with will conduct that evaluation. Now, I also need to make sure you understand that because this is an independent educational evaluation, schools are entitled to the results of that evaluation. So they will get copies of that as well. And so when it comes to reevaluations, you can request a reevaluation anytime you think it's appropriate. If you're seeing difficulties, if things aren't going well, and you think, I think something else is going on. This isn't just normal being behind. This is something else. You can ask for a reevaluation. If your student is falling further and further behind, and you want to know exactly where they are performing compared to their same grade peers, you have every right to ask for a reevaluation. Sometimes schools tend to compare students with disabilities only to other students with disabilities, but they should actually be compared to all of that grade level student. And saying things like, oh, they're doing great, is not an appropriate um, is not an appropriate reporting on a goal or anything else, because your definition of great and my definition of great may very well be different. Um, and I said that this was about 10 slides down. I was wrong. It was literally the next slide, because schools are actually required to conduct new evaluations every 3 years unless the case conference committee agrees that it's not necessary. And you are a full member of the case conference committee. If you think it's necessary, they have to do it. One of the things I have seen, especially in the last, 10 or so years, is that schools routinely tell parents, oh, we don't have to do that anymore. Yes, you do, unless the parent agrees that it's not necessary. Now, as the parent, you certainly have the ability to waive the idea of them doing a new evaluation, but schools saying that they don't have to do it anymore is simply not true. They are legally required to do a reevaluation every 3 years unless the entire case conference committee agrees that it is not necessary. So let's talk about that case conference committee, and especially let's talk about the composition of the case conference committee, because so often it feels like you're all alone. You walk into a room with like 8 other people and you're by yourself. And a lot of parents tend to feel intimidated when that happens. But the case conference committee is supposed to be comprised of the special education teacher or the teacher of record, the general education teacher, and if they have multiple general education teachers, guess what? All of those general education teachers are required to be there. Now, I'll be perfectly honest. I have never seen all of the specials teacher in any case conference committee, but especially if you're having issues in one particular special, like music, like PE, or something like that, you can absolutely say, hey, the PE teacher needs to be there. They'll also have what's called an agency representative. That's a school personnel who has the authority to authorize services. They're the ones who can agree and sign off to the different things that you need. Most importantly, you are a member of the case conference committee. Your student is a member of the case conference committee. Schools may tend, Ideally, schools should be inviting the student into all of this. And especially as they get older, it's more appropriate for them to be there. But even at early childhood, even at kindergarten, the idea of your student taking part in this is important, because what you're doing is you're showing your child, first of all, that they are valued. You're teaching them what their rights are, what they are supposed to be doing and working on, and you're reinforcing the idea that they have a voice in all of this. So consider having your student as part of the case conference committees. I know that that's still a little bit unusual, but in the long term, and setting things up for, setting the expectations for life, that yes, your student should be sitting at the table and should be a full participant in this, is setting them up to succeed in not just in school, but in adulthood as well. And then you can have others as needed. So, for example, if your child gets speech therapy, the speech therapist should be there. If you have waiver services and you want your behaviorist to be there, your behaviorist is allowed to be there. There's nothing from the school side that prevents them from doing that. If you want your best friend there just for moral support, you can have your best friend there just for moral support. If you need an advocate, you can absolutely have an advocate there. So you can bring other people to the case conference committee, but those are the people who are definitely supposed to be there. And one of the most important things I want you to know is you are an equal member of that case conference committee. That assistant principal has no more power in that room than you do. Okay? Make sure that you claim, that you internalize that, and remember that you are a full participant. You are equal to everyone in that room, and you have full partnership in creating that IEP. Now, one of the things that I also often see happen is that some of those members of the case conference committee aren't there. And that can be okay. I mean, in all honesty, I never needed the PE teacher there. Not that I'm dissing PE teachers, but that was never one of our issues. So if the PE teacher wasn't there, I was okay with that. But members of the case conference committee can only be excused if you agree, and if you agree in advance. So for example, one year when my son was in high school, my son has a lot of reading issues, and that's what we were talking about were the difficulties that he was having with reading. And so I get to the case conference committee, and lo and behold, the only people there are the special education department chair, because we were in high school. The We had an education consultant because I was already a pain in the neck to them by that point. His teacher of record, and the speech therapist and the occupational therapist. Those were the only people there. And I'm like, where's the English teacher? Oh, she doesn't have to be here. And I looked at them straight in the eye and said, she doesn't have to be here only if I agree to that in writing in advance. And I didn't. She needs to be here. Their eyes got about this big because, like I said, I was already that parent by then anyway. And they're like, well, we don't have a substitute for them. Are you telling me we need to reschedule then? I was making it very clear, first of all, that I was not happy, but that we weren't budging with having the English teacher there because we were there to discuss his reading issues. Surprise, surprise, they got somebody who went and covered her class so that we could actually have that discussion of what all was going with his reading. And we continued on. But I want you to know that you absolutely have the right to have whatever teacher there that you need to, and that they can only be excused if you agree in advance. So we've got another question here. Is there someone you recommend we can contact that could serve as an advocate, an entity, or a person? I'll be perfectly honest, that's where it gets a little bit difficult because organizations like InSource are absolutely fabulous. They are absolutely wonderful, and there is so much demand that it's difficult to keep up. Same with us here at the ARC. We will gladly talk you through all of this, but in order to be able to go to a case conference committee gets a little difficult. There are times where that can absolutely happen, and that's going to be kind of a case-by-case situation. And if things get bad enough that you actually need an attorney, that's where I would recommend either Indiana Disability Rights, or they're now called Ability Allies. They used to be Disability Legal Services of Indiana, and they've recently rebranded. But those are all organizations that you can talk with, ideally to prepare you in advance. Whether or not they would be able to actually go to your case conference, frankly, depends on scheduling. And I hate to say that, but it is one of the realities of this. But we also want to make sure that you know what your rights are, so that you not only feel comfortable enough in advocating for this, but also that you feel like you are empowered enough to be able to do that. So let's talk about that individualized education plan, or IEP. First of all, it should be strengths-based, okay? And it should list a student's current abilities. That's where I say saying he's doing great is completely meaningless, because your definition of great and my definition of great may not be the same thing. It needs to list their current abilities, and it needs to be realistic, and it needs to be accurate, okay? It will identify the goals to work on. That can be academic goals, that can be behavioral goals. Now, goals have to be educational in nature. So, for example, when my son was young, he had all sorts of sensory issues. And one of the things was that he was an extremely picky eater. Well, being an extremely picky eater was difficult for me, but that had nothing to do with his education. Therefore, it's not something that the school system could work on, even though he was getting occupational therapy through school. Whatever you're working on, those goals have to be educational in nature, and they have to be grade level appropriate. That works both ways. So, like when my son was in early childhood, he was in preschool. One of the things I wanted them to work on in occupational therapy with him was teaching him to tie his shoes. And the school district looked at me and said, that's a kindergarten standard, which meant they wouldn't work on it. Um, but the opposite is also true. So when he was in, frankly, when he was in high school and we were having those reading issues, and I said that, I explained what I wanted them to work on, they're like, that's a fifth grade skill. I'm like, exactly. It's a foundational skill that he didn't learn in fifth grade. So we need to teach it now so that we can build him back up to where he is supposed to be. So that grade level appropriateness goes both ways. The IEP also needs to list the accommodations that a student will have access to. Be careful with this because a lot of times, one of the things that the schools will put in there is they'll put in a loophole for themselves, saying that, we're going to provide these accommodations as needed, or we'll provide these services as available. If you're okay with that, that's perfectly fine. But if you're not okay with it, if you want to make sure certain accommodations are provided, regardless of whether or not the school thinks they're needed or whether or not your student asks for it, you need to make sure that that is in the IEP. Because sometimes we have students who may need an accommodation but haven't learned the skills yet to advocate for them or to ask for them. So, some of the things that we've run across are schools saying, well, he didn't ask for that and he really needs to ask for that. That's great if he has the skills and the confidence to speak up enough to ask for his accommodations. That doesn't always happen. And sometimes a student may need a support, but because of their disability, they're not able to ask for it. So, for example, if you've got a student who is having a meltdown, and you're expecting them to know and be able to verbally ask for a break, they may not be able to do that because they're in the midst of a meltdown. We shouldn't be denying them the break that they need simply because they can't ask for it. Um, so that's something else to be aware of. And then an IEP should identify the services and supports that a student is supposed to get, both the types of services and the frequency of services. And pay attention to that because sometimes, you may have occupational therapy listed, but it's listed as being on an as needed basis, or it's listed as consultation. There may be times where that's totally appropriate, where they've learned enough skills that, hey, we just need a checkup every now and then to make sure everything's fine. But if you're expecting your student to be getting, 20 minutes of occupational therapy every week, then it needs to say that in there. If you want to make sure that that if there's a snow day, if a student is absent because they're sick or something like that, and you want to ensure that there are makeup sessions, you need to make sure that the IEP addresses that. So, one of the things that I always recommend is that families stop and think about what they really want and to really think about that big picture of what they really want, because sometimes we get bogged down in the details. Is it really that we want them to be, reading 30 minutes or 30 words per minute out loud, or, we're really worried about the rate? Or is it that we really just want to make sure our kids can read? Is it really that we want to make sure that they can answer 15 math problems in 1 minute? Or is it that we want to make sure that when it comes to life, when it comes to adult life in particular, that they're able to learn how to manage money, they're able to manage a checkbook, they're able to do those life skill type things. I'm not saying don't focus on those things. What I'm saying is look at the big picture of what it is you really want. Ensure you have open communication with your school. Sometimes it's a little easier said than done, but especially if you go into this with the idea of fostering that open communication, having those discussions, building that relationship, it makes a huge difference. But also be open to different methods and options. Because again, sometimes we get bogged down in the details, and there may be some other ways that, we as parents may not know of, but schools may, whether that's technology, whether that's different tools to use, whatever the case may be open to it. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I'm saying be open to listen and find out, is it meeting your ultimate goal, what you truly want out of this? And then I also want you to make a list. I want you to list what are your non-negotiables in an IEP? What are the things you're willing to negotiate on? And what are the things that would be nice, but you're willing to give them up so that the school can feel like they got to win in all of this? So make that list just for yourself so that you know what you really want going into the case conference committee. And so one of the things that can be helpful are some tools from the life course framework. And I know that that may sound a little bit strange because if your child is involved with the Bureau of Disability Services, if they have a Medicaid waiver, maybe if they're working with pre-eds, maybe you have seen some of these things, but if you're not involved with them, you may never have seen any of this. And so there is a they'd get mad at me if I called it a program. There's this thing called the Life Course Framework. And the whole idea behind Life Course is what is your vision of a good life and how do we help you get there? This is one of the tools that they have, and you can find this at lifecoursetools.com. And the best part is it's free, okay? But this is their planning life trajectory. And you know, so up here in the top right-hand corner, we've got that, what is your vision of a good life? Down here at the bottom, what do you not want? Now, this is what's called a split trajectory. So, what are the past experiences you had that are getting you to your good life? What are the things you need going forward to get to your good life? Just as importantly, what are the past experiences you had that are taking you away from what you want? And what are the things you need to be careful of to avoid what you don't want? When my son was in high school, it was his senior year. Um, we had just gotten a new neuropsychological evaluation because we were preparing for Social Security. And, it showed us some things, including the fact that my son was back down to a sixth grade reading level. And so I brought this to the school district. And I'll be perfectly honest, they got really defensive about this, in part because they thought I was going to come in and start asking for all sorts of additional services and all of this. But one of the other things that I brought in a life trajectory to kind of facilitate that discussion of, okay, this is what we ultimately want in life. This is what we're working toward. And some of the things we had on there were things like, he wants to be able to live on his own. We want him to be able to manage his own money. We want him to be able, to read something at his job, because the reality is we've got to be able to read things in life. And as we were discussing this, the light bulb kind of went off for them. And they're like, so wait a second. This is about preparing for adulthood. This is about preparing for life after school. Because again, my son was starting his senior year. So yeah, that's where we were at with this. But it was like I said, the light bulb went off and they started looking at it in a completely different way. So their defenses went down once they realized that was our focus, was preparing for real life, and we could start having a more open discussion. One of the things we discovered, like I said, was that he was back down to a sixth grade reading level. And so then we started having that discussion because he wasn't going to grow sixth grade levels in reading in 1 year. And one of the things we had seen through his entire school career was that we would do intensive interventions. He would catch up, he'd stop the intensive interventions, and he'd slide back down. So at this point, school wasn't going to last forever. So we started talking about things like, okay, what are some other options we have? Can we do audiobooks? Can we do, things like that? And one of the things they talked about was some technology pieces, including the fact that there are apps out there where you can take a picture of something, it will convert it into a PDF, and then read it out loud to you. Now, somebody's going to ask me what that app is. I can't tell you that answer because I genuinely don't know it. But consider doing something like this so that you can have some of those discussions and keep that ultimate goal, what you truly want in life, in mind. Now, another part of that life trajectory tool is well, I call it a cheat sheet to the person, because here it's, what do people like and admire about me? What's important to me? How do you best support me? Imagine if you could hand that to your child's teachers at the beginning of the school year. How much easier would that make life? Not only for your student, but for the teacher as well. Like I said, this is a cheat sheet to your loved one, and so it makes life a little bit easier. So when it comes to goals, craft those goals based on your ultimate goal, what you want true life to be like. Have high expectations, because if you don't have high expectations, nobody else is going to have them either. And then you want goals to be SMART. And that is actually an acronym, meaning you want them to be specific, you want them to be measurable, you want them to be attainable. Like I said, you're not going to make up sixth grade levels of reading in one single school year. You want them to be relevant, and you want them to be time-based. Now, oftentimes when we're talking about time-based, they're looking at achieving that over the course of a school year. But it doesn't just have to be that. You could have a short-term goal for the first 6 weeks of school just to get somebody acclimated, especially if they're changing school buildings. If they're going from elementary school to middle school, you may have a short-term goal for 6 weeks about making sure the student can find all of their classes and can open their locker and get to class on time. So you can also have some short-term goals built in there as well. So some example goals, instead of Andy will improve his reading skills, because that is so vague, nobody knows what that means. Instead of something like that, have after reading a grade level passage, because we wanted to make it grade level, Andy will demonstrate reading comprehension by scoring at least 75% on a short quiz on 4 out of 5 data days. So there we've got it measurable. It's not this vague, oh, he's going to do better. It's he's going to do better by scoring at least 75%. We've got two measurable things there, because it's not just that he's going to do that once and the rest of the time he's in the 30s. It's he's going to consistently maintain that. Now sometimes schools get a little nervous about that because they're like, A, that's really high, and B, well, he can't do that. Well, of course he can't do that right now. That's why it's a goal. Our goal is that by the end of the year he's going to be able to do this. Instead of Andy will turn in homework on time each week, that sounds like it's a measurable goal because it's measuring each week. It's that he's turning in his homework. But I've seen some schools who are like, well, he turned in one assignment all week long on time, so therefore that goal is achieved. Nah, it's not. So instead of something like he'll turn in his homework on time each week, Andy will turn in all assignments on time with no more than 2 verbal prompts and 1 late assignment each week. That's something that's very specific. It is very measurable. It is certainly attainable. It is relevant. And typically, because it's set over the course of a school year, it is also timely. Instead of Andy will socialize with peers and make new friends, because what in the world does that even mean? Andy will join one extracurricular activity of his choosing and attend 75% or more of the activities meetings as indicated by the extracurricular activity. That's what ECA stood for, sponsor. So those are goals that are specific, that are measurable, that are attainable, that are relevant, and time-based. So now I want to talk about those key rights, okay? First of all, you have the right to call a case conference committee anytime you want to. You are an equal partner in that case conference committee. But one of the things you can also do so that you don't always have to call a case conference committee is that you can actually set up recurring meetings in the IEP. So for example, we were having some trouble at one point with school. And so one of the things we did while he was in middle school was we set it up so that we had regular meetings with his teacher of record and with his language arts teacher every 6 weeks. And we were doing that not to be pains in the neck, but so that we could talk about things and have a better idea of what was going on, and that we could preemptively do things rather than waiting till the end of the year when everything was kind of blowing up and we were really far behind. We were doing this proactively to be able to address concerns as we saw them. You can also Request evaluations, and you can request independent evaluations. Our one questioner earlier was absolutely right. The school was like, oh, we don't have to do that anymore. And when she said, really, show me that in writing, they backtracked because they knew that that was not correct. You have the right to request an evaluation. I've also seen schools flat out ignore those requests. I've seen that a lot lately, which is really not making me very happy. One of the things you do when you send that email is say, hey, I'm requesting this. I'm requesting this evaluation. I expect to have the permission form sent home as quickly as possible. When can we schedule that? Because you just switched the outlook from, hey, I'm asking for this to, oh no, we are having it. When will it happen? That changes the tone and that changes the perspective of how this is going to go. It also subtly signals to your school district, hey, I know what I'm talking about. Don't mess with me. One of the other key rights you have is that an IEP is enforceable, meaning if it's written in the IEP, the school has to do it. Sometimes schools think it's optional. It is not. Sometimes they think of Article 7, which are what we commonly call Indiana special education laws. Some schools tend to think of them as guidelines or suggestions. They're not. They're Indiana state laws, and they are absolutely enforceable. Now, getting it enforced can be an issue, but you've got the backing if you need it. That's why I say make sure you're reading that IEP and you're reading to make sure that the school hasn't given themselves any loopholes in all of this. That was something that we faced at one point when my son was a freshman in high school. Um, High schools can be really huge and can be really confusing. And my son actually went to the wrong classes for at least the first day, and nobody noticed. I only noticed because I was asking him about the classes he was supposed to have. So one of the things we put in his IEP was that his teacher of record was going to walk through his new schedule before the end of the semester or the trimester, so that he would know where to go. And because we had this issue, one of the things I put in there was that this was to be done without exception. Now, it didn't necessarily have to be the teacher of record, but some school personnel had to actually, walk through his schedule with him a few times so that he would know where he was going. And then literally a couple years later, they didn't do it. And he went to the wrong classes again because we go to a huge school. So getting lost in there is super easy. Um, but I was mad, because this was in his IEP and it was in his IEP saying that they would do it without exception. And so when I went to discuss this with them, the director of student services was like, oh, well, it says that, and this is done as needed. And I looked at him straight in the eye and I said, and right here it says this will be done without exception. Don't pull that on me. He realized they messed up. And thankfully it never happened again. But that's why you need to make sure that you've got stuff like that in there. So an IEP is enforceable. But one of the most important rights you have, one of the most powerful things you have is that you have veto power. And what I mean by that is if you disagree with the IEP, you can contest it within 10 instructional days and it cannot go into effect. Now, sometimes I talk to parents and they say, well, I didn't sign the IEP. Years ago, that was sufficient. It no longer is. In order for that IEP not to go into effect, you actually have to formally contest that. And what I mean by that is you send an email saying, I do not believe this IEP is appropriate. I do not believe it provides a free and appropriate public education to my student. Therefore, we contest its implementation. So you want to make sure you say you disagree, and you want to make sure you use the word contest. And again, I recommend doing that by email so you've got that time date stamp on there. And if you contest it, they cannot implement it. Also kind of keep an eye on it because sometimes you may think that your IEP is still in draft stage, but somebody has actually closed the IEP, meaning that they have finalized it. And as soon as it's finalized, as soon as it's closed, that's when that 10 instructional day calendar starts. So, look to see if the word draft is printed on the page. But if you contest an IEP, the previous IEP stays in effect until you reconvene the case conference committee and get a new one in place. Do that a couple times, the school starts getting a whole lot more cooperative with you because they realize that you're not going to just roll over and do whatever they tell you to do. No, you have the power in this. See another question. Why doesn't the IEP have a disagree line on it? Just an agree line, and ours is electronic. That's a really interesting question. I'll be honest, nobody's ever asked me that before, and I've never even thought of that before. It's a great idea, and certainly one that we can share. The state said that they have to prove they provided it, and you have to agree to receive it electronically. They can't just send it electronically. And I think those are some of the newer things that are happening right now as we become more of an electronic society. That some of this is evolving because our society is evolving, technology is evolving, and what we expect is evolving too. So thank you for sharing that. This particular parent is having some issues with her school district, and so the state is involved with that. And I'll get more into that, not her specific case, but about the state getting involved here in a couple of minutes. One of the other key rights you have, and I'll get into this more in depth here in a moment, is that schools are required to convene a manifestation determination hearing if they plan to discipline a student with an IEP or a 504 plan. Now, the two have different rules for that, but if your student has an IEP and the school is trying to discipline them, and that does not just mean expulsion, and it does not just mean suspension. If the school wants to give your student detention, if the school wants to take away your elementary student's recess, and you have an IEP, they are required to hold a manifestation determination hearing in most cases before that discipline can occur. Like I said, I'll get more to that in just a minute because I want to talk about a few more rights that you have. As the parent, you can also request a facilitated IEP. So there's an organization called the IEP Resource Center. They can also be a good resource for you. They are not advocates. What they are there to do is help facilitate the IEP, get everybody talking, help with the communication, ideally so that everybody can come together to agree. So if that could be something that could be helpful for you, you can request a facilitated IEP. Then, as a parent, you also have the right to request mediation. Now, first of all, mediation is where an objective third party leads the meeting. It's not a case conference meeting, but it's just a regular meeting to facilitate discussions to help come to agreement. Okay. I will also tell you that when it comes to mediation, Vegas rules are in place, meaning what happens in mediation stays in mediation. If the school says something during mediation, you cannot use that information outside of mediation. Okay, so know that in advance. But I will also tell you, if you are requesting mediation, first of all, the school is required to pay all costs associated with mediation, which means there's a good chance that they're dropping a couple grand to make that happen. You start costing the school money and they start getting a little more cooperative. Now, am I saying that that's a good thing? No. Am I saying that's how you should do things? I'm not saying that either. But I am saying that is a reality that I have seen. Okay. So use that in your back pocket. Mediation's not a nuclear option, but it's a bit of an ICBM kind of option here. Okay. Another right you have is the right to file a complaint. Now, a complaint does not mean, hey, this school's awful. A complaint is where you file an official complaint with the Indiana Department of Education to say this school violated this section of the law on this date, and here were the consequences of that. Okay. It's not just, hey, the school's not very good. It's the school has broken the law, and here's how they did it, and here were the tangible consequences of that. And when you file a complaint with the Department of Education, the Department of Education then comes to investigate to see if they believe that it was a violation of the law. A complaint is a major issue. Okay, it is a big deal. So know you have that as an option. Know that that is in your back pocket, because if things get that bad, you have that option. But know that it is a major option. And then you also have the ability to file a due process hearing. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest, a due process hearing is a court hearing. So you're going to need an attorney to do that. Okay, not just an advocate, you want an attorney for that. And so that's where somebody like Indiana Disability Rights or Ability Allies may be able to help you with that. There are some private special education attorneys here in Indiana. There aren't necessarily a ton, but there are a few. But a due process hearing is a really, really major option, but it is one of your rights. So now let's talk about behaviors, because that is one of the biggest issues that we come across, is that families and schools are disagreeing over behavior issues, or behavior issues being addressed appropriately. Behavior can absolutely be an educational issue in and of itself. Sometimes I hear schools say, oh, well, there's no academic impact here, therefore we can't give you an IEP, while simultaneously sending the kid home 3 days a week early. Well, when they're doing stuff like that, obviously their behaviors are absolutely impacting their education, because it's taking them away from the general education setting. So behavior in and of itself can be an educational concern, even if there's not academic concerns, because it impedes the student's education or involvement with grade level peers or an inclusive environment. Okay. One of the things you can do, and we'll get more into this in just a moment, is you can have a behavior intervention plan. And it's important to know you can have a behavior intervention plan even without having an IEP. Okay. You do not have to have an IEP to have a behavior intervention plan. And the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights has actually issued guidelines to schools on avoiding the discriminatory use of student discipline, because we have some schools across the country who use discipline as a way to discriminate against students with disabilities. Okay. Schools must support a student's behavior needs. Just saying his behaviors are out of control and we're putting him on homebound placement is not acceptable. The schools have a legal obligation to support behavior needs. So when it comes to modified days, like we're gonna only let him come half days. When it comes to homebound placement, when it comes to the overuse of suspension, including in-school suspension, that can be considered an improper change of placement and a denial of a free and appropriate public education. So when it comes to addressing behaviors, if your loved one is having behaviors in school, and especially if those behaviors are impeding school, and that's not necessarily because the student is being bad, or because the teacher isn't doing what they should be. There are a lot of things that cause behaviors. Behavior is a form of communication, and we need to understand what that person is trying to communicate through their behaviors. No kid has behaviors just to have behaviors. They're having behaviors because there's a problem and they don't know how to address it. So one of the things you can do is you can request a functional behavior assessment. Okay. That is an evaluation that is conducted over multiple days. Again, so we're not just getting one really good day or one really bad day here. We want to see them over multiple days, and we want to see them over multiple settings, so that Or if we have one particular setting where we know that they always melt down, we want to make sure that they're getting observed then and there too. So that we can get a good picture of what's actually going on. But that functional behavior assessment will first of all identify the behaviors and what's really going on. It'll identify the function of the behavior. Why is the individual doing it? What are they hoping to achieve through their behavior? It will identify contributing factors and early warning signs, you know, and it will lead to the design of a plan to prevent and address the behaviors. That's called a behavior intervention plan. And the idea behind that behavior intervention plan is let's figure out what's going on. Let's figure out what's causing these behaviors so that we can prevent them before they even happen. So if, for example, we recognize, hey, this kid has a meltdown every day at 11 o'clock. Why are they having a meltdown every day at 11 o'clock? Well, what's going on? It could be that 11 o'clock is when we have math and they're just feeling so overwhelmed that's why they're having the behavior. Or it's, that's when we're doing handwriting and it turns out handwriting is so difficult. What they really need is occupational therapy and we need to get some more interventions in there so that they're not having a meltdown from the stress of having to do all that handwriting. Could also be that, hey, the kid is hangry. You know, they got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's 11 o'clock now, and they haven't had anything to eat since breakfast. They're hungry, and so they're cranky. So maybe we give them a snack, something as simple as that. Or maybe we're having some sensory issues. Maybe it's that they're having too much visual stimulation, too much auditory stimulation. But that's what the functional behavior assessment is supposed to help figure out. What is triggering this behavior? And what are they hoping to achieve through their behavior? Okay. That's the ideal. But you also need to know that if you disagree with the functional behavior assessment that the school district does, you can request an independent functional behavior assessment as well. So I've got another question here. Um, um, if there are behavior issues, is it possible to request a behaviorist in the IEP meeting? It absolutely is. If you're requesting one from the school district, sometimes more and more school districts are actually having behaviorists either on staff or on contract. So that can certainly be an option. That can also be the school psychologist. That can be a behavior consultant. So every school district has an autism resource team, and oftentimes as part of that autism resource team, they will have a behavior specialist as part of that, or the co-op, if your school belongs to a co-op, may have behavior specialists. You can absolutely request them to be part of that. That's a great idea. If you're talking about, you have a waiver behavior management or behavior consultant, and you're asking if they can be part of it, they can go to the meetings if they want to, and if their company agrees to it, but they can't provide services in the school district or in the school building because waiver rules prevent them from providing services in the school setting. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of clarify that. Um, so let's talk about that behavior intervention plan. It uses the data from that functional behavior assessment to develop that plan. And the idea is that the plan is there to help prevent behaviors before they start. We don't want a student who's melting down. We want to prevent that. We want to short circuit that before it ever happens. And so this behavior intervention plan should identify appropriate intervention strategies and supports and put those in place to prevent the behaviors or to address and limit behaviors if they occur. Now, here's the thing. If your student has an IEP, that behavior intervention plan is part of the IEP, and therefore it is enforceable. Second, you should be included in creating that behavior intervention plan. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, but it should happen. You are a full member of that case conference committee, and you should be included in creating that behavior intervention plan, especially because you know your child. You know some of the things that help set them off. You know some of the things that help work when things are going bad at home or in other settings. So you have a lot of valuable information to help in creating that behavior intervention plan as well. Here's the other thing. All school personnel who interact with a student should be trained in the behavior intervention plan. Sometimes just the special ed teacher or just the classroom teacher get trained. Sometimes they remember to include the specials teachers. But here's the thing, if your kid rides the bus driver should be trained in the behavior intervention plan too. Anybody who interacts with your student should be trained in their behavior intervention plan. And if the school develops a behavior intervention plan and you disagree with it, you have the right to contest its implementation. Because I have seen some functional behavior assessments that say that the behavior is just to get control and be defiant. Okay, that could be happening. There's also a good chance that that's not really what's going on. And so they draft this plan based on this kid just trying to be defiant. Well, if you disagree with that, guess what? You can contest the implementation. And in doing so, especially with something like that, it would be appropriate to say, hey, I disagree with all of these findings. I'd like an independent evaluation, an independent functional behavior assessment, and the development of an independent behavior intervention plan. Because the behavior intervention plan is about stopping unwanted actions. But there are other ways that you can stop unwanted actions, because a lot of times one of the things that I will see is that schools start sending kids home on a regular basis early, or they decide they're going to put them on half days or on homebound placement. Or maybe the school wants to change their placement. And by that, I mean, instead of having them in the general education setting, they want to put them just in the resource room. Or maybe they want to change them from the resource room to the alternative school. Or they want to take a student off diploma track. By the way, schools can get a little sneaky about that, because they don't say, oh, we're taking them off diploma track. What they say are things like, we're going to focus on life skills. We're going to focus on job skills. I think it's great to focus on life skills and to focus on job skills. I still want them getting a diploma, okay, if they are able to. Okay. And I want that discussion about whether or not to take them off diploma track to be as far out in the future as possible. Because here's the thing, if you take a kid off of diploma track in third grade, the chances of you ever getting them back on diploma track are extremely small. So those are some things. And you can stop those unwanted actions. You don't feel like you've got the power to do it. And I often talk with families whose kid has been put on half days or on homebound placement, and now suddenly they're losing their job because there's nobody to stay at home with their child. Here's the thing, if you don't want your child to be put on half days or homebound placement, you can typically stop that. And you stop that by contesting it within 10 instructional days to prevent it from going into effect. Because most of these things are things that require change to the IEP. And you can contest the implementation of the new IEP. Sometimes schools will tell you you don't have a choice. You absolutely do. Okay. And then the case conference committee has to reconvene to come up with an agreement. Now, the exception to that is if a student is an active and imminent danger to themselves or others. So if your student is getting violent, if your student is bringing weapons, if your student is bringing drugs to school, they can absolutely remove you even without your agreement, and they don't have to hold the manifestation hearing first. Okay. So there are exceptions to this, but as a general rule, know that you have the ability to stop unwanted actions. So let's talk about discipline, because oftentimes that's where this is really stemming from. So when it comes to removals, and that's the term that we're using here, that includes being sent home early. That includes out-of-school suspensions. That may include in-school suspensions unless the student can still progress in the general education curriculum, unless they can participate in special education services. So, that still means, getting their therapies and getting their interventions while they're in school suspension, or unless they can participate with non-disabled peers to a normal extent. Okay. But if they are sent to in-school suspension in a room by themselves, guess what? That is considered a removal, especially if they are not getting access to their special education services. Expulsions are removals. Removal from the bus if transportation is part of the IEP. Okay. Removal for 10 consecutive days is considered a change of placement. But removal for 10 cumulative days can be considered a change of placement if it's for the same or similar behaviors. And here's the thing, a change of placement is a major issue. That is something that can only be done through the IEP, which means you have to agree to it. So let's talk about those manifestation determination hearings, okay? First of all, anytime a student with an IEP or a student with a 504 plan is set to be disciplined, okay? Again, that doesn't just mean suspension. That doesn't just mean expulsion. If they want to give your kid detention, they have to hold a manifestation determination hearing. Now, in real life, what often happens is the assistant principal pulls a form out of their desk, makes a couple of check marks, and signs it, and poof, it's done. That is not a manifestation determination hearing. A manifestation determination hearing is that within 10 days of the behavior, you have to convene the entire case conference committee to determine if the behavior leading to the change of placement or to the discipline was a direct result of the disability. Okay. And they do mean a direct result of the disability. So, for example, if you have a student who stutters and they have a speech IEP and they're getting bullied for their stuttering and they get into a fist fight. Technically, that is not a direct result of the disability. Now, I'll be honest, I would argue that case. But having a stutter does not make you punch someone, is why they say that is not a direct result of the disability. I have absolutely seen schools discipline a child with ADHD for not paying attention in class. I have absolutely seen schools discipline a student with oppositional defiant disorder for disobeying the teacher. Those are absolutely direct results of the disability. I mean, my goodness, those are literally the diagnostic criteria. You cannot discipline a student for a direct result of the disability because then you're essentially punishing the student for having a disability. So if the behavior is not directly related to the disability, you can proceed with the change of placement. You can proceed with the discipline. Now, if you disagree, you cannot stop the change of placement, but you can file for mediation or due process. Okay. But if the behavior is a direct result or substantially related to the disability, or a result of the student's failure to implement the IEP, including the behavior intervention plan, you cannot change the placement and you cannot discipline the student. So now let's talk about homebound placement because this is one that we get a lot of calls about as well. You can stop homebound placement if you can test the IEP changing placement within 10 instructional days. When a student, now the exception to that is if there is a weapon or drugs or serious bodily harm, okay? But if a student is on homebound placement, the school must still provide an education. I have seen schools who say, 60 minutes of consultation once a week. That is not a free and appropriate public education. And even when a student is on homebound placement, schools are required to provide a free and appropriate public education. I would love to see a school justify to a hearing officer that 1 hour of consultation a week is an appropriate education. But what that also means in practice is that schools are required to send teachers and therapists to the home if they're going to put a student on homebound placement. Here's the other thing that often does not happen but is required to. If a school puts a student on homebound placement, They must develop a plan to return to school, and they must be working on that plan from the very beginning. Keep in mind, homebound placement in and of itself is not a bad thing, but homebound placement was really designed for the kid who gets cancer and is going through chemotherapy. It wasn't designed as a punishment for kids who have behavior problems, and that's often what seems to happen in practice. Okay. Um, like I said, if a student is put on homebound placement, the school must develop a plan and start working on that plan to return that student to school as soon as possible. And the school is required to convene the case conference committee every 60 days until that student returns to school. So often one of the things I see is that a school puts a student on homebound placement, tells the parent that they have no choice in this, and it's basically out of sight, out of mind. We'll wish you the best of luck. That is not legal and it is not acceptable. And it can be considered a denial of a free and appropriate public education. So here's the thing. I want to open it up to questions at this point because I'm sure we have a lot of questions and we've gotten some really good ones so far. So go ahead and ask your questions. Um, I'll give you a few minutes to type. And I know that this can be intimidating. I know that, I know from my own experience, despite the fact that, I was well versed in special education law, despite the fact that I understood all of these things, it was still difficult to walk into a room with a bunch of people and feel like we were at odds. And it was still difficult to make sure that I knew what was going on. Um, you have the right to know how well your student is doing. And one of the things I was often running into was they'd be like, "Oh, he's doing great." Well, like I've said all along, your definition of great and my definition of great do not necessarily mean the same thing. I want to know how he's doing compared to his same grade level peers. When he was in elementary school, I said that we had a lot of reading issues, and one of the things that happened was every single year, our elementary school changed whatever reading program they were using, so you couldn't compare growth from year to year. So, like one year he may be reading at a level O, the next year he's reading at a level 12, and the year after that he's reading at a level LL. How do you compare all of those? They literally made me a comparison chart to help me compare all of the different programs that they had been using throughout his elementary school so that I could figure out how he was actually doing. And that's one of the things. Ideally, you create a good relationship with your school system. Ideally, you have that open dialogue, you have that open communication. Um, and one way to get that, one way that is effective is to let them know what is your ultimate goal? Why are what is your motivation behind all of this? Because I think sometimes, schools think that that you're just asking for services or you know, or you're being that parent. I made peace with being that parent when my kid was in first grade. You know, I'm not asking for daily communication to be a pain in your neck. I'm asking for daily communication so that I know what's going on and I can address any behavior concerns that we may have. When my son was in elementary, um, we had a year in fourth grade where we were constantly being told, "Oh, he's doing great." And and so we were thrilled. In fact, we actually changed his medical interventions. We stretched out the amount of time he was going in between seeing his psychologist. We changed his medications because they told us how great he was doing. And then in January, the wheels fell off. And suddenly they're telling me he's constantly having behaviors and he's out of control and all this. I'm like, what happened? Why did we suddenly change? You've been telling me all year he's doing great. What happened? Because we were trying to figure that out so that we could address it. And they go, "Oh, well, no, he's been doing these things all year." I'm like, "Well, that's not what you said. You've been telling me all year he's doing great." And they said, "Oh, well, we only told you if it got really bad." First of all, that's not what his IEP required. Secondly, we changed his medical intervention based on the information that we were getting from the school. And it turns out that that information was not correct. That's why it's important that you have that open communication. And that's why ultimately we started having those regular meetings set up with the school that was written into our IEP where we would meet every 6 weeks to prevent any problems before they happen. And that actually worked out really well. We were able to develop a good relationship, especially in intermediate and in middle school. I'm probably the only human being out there who can say that middle school were some of our best years. And it was because we had that open communication and dialogue. Um, I'm not seeing any other questions right now. Somebody did ask where they can see old Ask the ARC sessions. Those are on our YouTube channel. If you go to the ARC of Indiana on YouTube, you'll be able to see a lot of our past sessions. Also, you can check out the ARC Academy, which is advocacy.thearcacademy.org. And you can see a lot of different videos, webinars, and even short little introductory videos on a lot of disability related issues. So hold on, I maybe see one more question here. So I just want to say thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope that this was helpful, but if you need to talk more, by all means, call us here at the ARC. Every single person who works for the Advocacy Network is either a parent, a self-advocate, or a sibling. So we all live this life too. You betcha we're going to talk to you about what's going on. You bet we're going to be able to tailor that information to your specific needs, give you some new ideas on ways to address things or things to ask for. We can absolutely have those discussions and help you feel better prepared for going into your case conference committee. I wish all of you luck in your upcoming case conferences and have a good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.